One of the most popular and overpopulated film genres is the classic teen movie, with its montages of students flowing into the school gates, its complex ecosystems of friend groups in the canteen, the homecoming dances, the house parties in the suburbs, the red cups.
Red Solo Cup, I fill you up, let's have a party.
As Charlie Lynn writes in Beyond Clueless, high school is hypnotic. It ticks and it tocks, drawing us into a world we know all too well, from memories, dreams, and most of all, the movies. So, it's no wonder that Sex Education, a show that's been described as a British homage to American teen film, has been an utter, bursting sensation. But is it good? Everybody and their sex therapist mother has been raving about it. But has anybody sapped all remaining joy out of it with a pseudo-intellectual critique? No. Fear not, because me and my 2-1 are here to help. So sit down, honey. Why don't you go and fix yourself a drink while I slip into something a little more 90s teen movie? Now, before we can talk about sex education, we simply must talk about reality and fantasy because I'm really deep, but also because I think a lot of us understand our teen years through the fantasy version of them that's projected back at us in the movies. And when it comes to fantasizing, who better to bring in but Western psychology's favourite manic pixie dream boy, Sigmund Freud. You like Freud? Name 5 songs. Many people will be aware of Freud and his greatest hits, like the interpretation of dreams or the wish fulfillment theory, which is that the motive forces of fantasies are unsatisfied wishes, and every single fantasy is the fulfillment of a wish, a correction of an unsatisfying reality. Basically, you dream about shit that you want. So far, so Psychology 101. But what's far more interesting is when Freud extended this theory to talk about popular culture. Freud said that predictable hero journeys in popular literature, good triumphing over evil or the prince finding the princess, are all tied up in this idea of fantasy. The main character is the hero who represents the ego, and all the other characters, the villains, the sidekicks, the love interests, the mean girls, are by necessity one-dimensional because they only exist to give our hero something to fight against or fight for. In an interview about his film Submarine, Richard Iodi linked this idea to teen film.
Because coming-of-age novels or films feel that they're in some way based on the maker, they're very kind to themselves, and essentially the plot of those films is waiting for the world to realise how great this person really is.
Our boy Freud explains that in the same way that all of us dream about the fulfilment of our desires, like waiting for the world or, Robbie, to realise how great we really are, writers take this a step further by turning these dreams into stories. I know, writers are sad. Anyone else who wishes they were a bit cooler in high school can then relate to these stories, meaning they become wildly popular. Not only do they represent the desires of the writer, but they also represent the desires of the many people who watch them. So narratives and tropes at the heart of popular culture can come to reflect the dreams and desires of the society that consumes them. Or as Freud would put it, the distorted vestiges of the wishful fantasies of whole nations, the secular dreams of youthful humanity. Are you keeping up? As an example, let's take classic teen movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, written and directed by the legend that is John Hughes. John Hughes's young heroes were certainly confused, frustrated and angry, but they ultimately proved steely enough to triumph over the stifling confinement of suburban life. But was John Hughes steely enough to triumph over the stifling confinement of suburban life when he was in high school? The answer is I don't know, because I haven't done any research. But it's my hunch that John Hughes came up with this great idea for a film where a super popular kid skives off and has a wild adventure when he was stuck in the back of a classroom, bored out of his mind and fantasising about everything he'd much rather be doing. And then he became John Hughes, the amazing teen film director, and he wrote all of these fantasies down so he could make them real through the movies. And Ferris Bueller was born. And is still super popular today because every sane person in the world has at some point fantasised about skiving off and having a wild adventure, but very few of us have the balls to actually do it. So instead you watch someone else do it in a film, where you can indulge in the fantasy without having to face any of the personal consequences in real life. You know, consequences like detention for truancy, Ferris, or getting bollocked for crashing your dad's motor. So the idea behind Ferris Bueller started out as a daydream in one individual's mind, but then it became a kind of collective dream that its entire audience can share in.
Ferris Bueller, you're my hero.
Unless, of course, you don't need to use film to indulge in your fantasies because you're already a kind of real-life Ferris Bueller who's young and wild and free, and in that case all I have to say to you is nothing, because people like you don't watch sad little videos like this. You're probably busy, probably boning. Anyway, here's part 2. So, we stan teen films not because they're realistic, but because they're a bit ludicrous, and they represent a fantasy, dreamlike version of our teens. And that fantasy, dreamlike version is pretty much always American. This that prom shit. This that what we do, don't tell your mum shit. This that red cups all on the lawn shit. Got a fresh cut straight out the salon. But here in the UK, where I'm from, high school didn't really look like the movies. It was a bit less pool party and a bit more Jane Norman bag as a PE kit. None of the cool kids wore Letterman jackets, nobody hung out by the lockers, and nobody's parties had those red plastic cups. We'd just drink warm Strongbow out the can and stand awkwardly in the corner until our mums came to pick us up. Although at my party, people did drink Strongbow out of red cups because I ordered red cups especially online so I could feel like I was in a teen movie. Am I cool yet? But why is sex education so hyper-Americanised when it's cast as British? The show is full of all the American teen movie trappings. The lockers, the Letterman jackets, the plastics, the jocks, the super American high school building, the rural American vibe of the settings, the fact that it's always sunny. Isn't it all a bit jarring? Why does it go all Gavin and Stacey one minute and Mean Girls the next? And why, in God's name, is Gerard from Peep Show suddenly prancing around in some teen movie happy clappy funfair straight out of Greece? But even though sex education's aesthetic might initially be a bit odd, it is just annoyingly charming. It's just very pretty, okay? And we can academically analyse how it's pretty or why it's pretty or whether that prettiness is problematic, but at the end of the day, we all just like watching pretty stuff. And to be fair, it is very difficult for a feel-good teen show like Sex Education not to have some visual relationship with the American high school aesthetic that has informed this genre for so long. So for better or worse, I actually ended up kind of loving this side of Sex Education. I mean, it's totally unrealistic, but as we've discussed, teen films aren't really about reality. And even though lots of us aren't American, we've all had the American teenage dream rammed down our throats so often through the teen movies that we grew up on that it's impossible not to relate to it on some level. It doesn't really matter where you're from, your favourite teen movie is still going to be 10 Things I Hate About the Perks of Being a Clueless Mean Girl I've Loved Before at Breakfast Club High School musical. The aesthetics of these films may not match up with our teen reality, but they certainly match up with our teen fantasy. I actually think it's kind of cool that instead of pretending that this Americanised teen movie fantasy world isn't there, Sex Education decided to lean into it and hyper-stylise it to the point of almost satire. In a way, what sort of show did we expect to crop up after people have grown up on American teen films for so long? A generation of Brits have grown up on these teen movies, so is it that weird that they're referencing them when they look at their own teens? No, I don't think so. But still, Gerard? I can't get over the Gerard thing. And by the way, Gerard in his Twitter profile looks like he's about to come up to me in the back of a Shoreditch cafe and ask to borrow my MacBook charger. What's that about? Let's move on. So the creators of Sex Education have openly admitted that we should see the show as a kind of British love letter to classic teen film. But if you wanted to watch something in the style of a classic teen film, why not just watch a classic teen film? Well, I'm about to tell you, so just wait. Well, for one thing, Sex Education has a refreshingly original plot, where high school student Otis becomes a kind of vigilante sex therapist for a group of horny teenagers at his school. I mean, who wouldn't want to watch that? But this plot also allows the show to move away from this ego as main character narrative structure that is so predominant in teen movies. At first glance, we might see Otis as the main character. I mean, he's a straight white man, so how could he not be? But if Sex Education was truly written along a ego as the main character style plot arc with Otis at the centre, it would be a very different show. It would revolve entirely around Otis going on some sort of hero's journey. Maeve would be the love interest that he gets with at the end, and Jackson would be the evil villain who stands in Otis's way. All the other teen stereotypes would be thrown in, but they would exist only to prop up Otis's journey in some way. The hot mean girl, the hot edgy girl, the sexless nerdy girl, the evil bully, the overbearing parent, the jock, and the gay best friend. Sex Education might start out with all of the stereotypical teen characters, but they're all developed into something new by the end. Everyone goes on their own journey in the show, instead of everybody propping up the main character's journey. Otis is more just the string that ties the entire show together, allowing for a lot of different stories and narratives to be shown through him instead of revolving around him. Far from the faultless hero that we're all meant to relate to, Otis is actually a bit of a dick. He's a dick to Maeve, he's a dick to Orla, the detty pig is even a dick to Eric. Otis and Maeve must be the only characters in TV and film history who meet by bumping into each other and dropping their books in the corridor and still don't end up together by the end. But personally, that doesn't bother me. I like that it's subverting a trope, and Otis and Maeve aren't the only characters you care about by the end of the show. The plotline of Otis and Maeve, will they, won't they, is just one thread of a larger story. By the end of series 2, we don't even know if it's going to work out between them. And in the end, the happy ending feeling that we thought we'd get from those two getting together comes in far more unexpected places. We get the happy ending feeling in moments like this, or this, which made me cry my eyes out. If we only cared about Otis because he was the only developed character, then we wouldn't love the endings that we get as much as we do. And sure, this isn't totally new. For example, a lot of John Hughes' teen movies aren't just about one character. Teen stereotypes are questioned and developed by the end of the film. But this questioning was very of its time. It's still usually resolved in guy gets girl, or even girl has to change so guy can get girl. Sex Education, on the other hand, develops these questions further and updates them for a modern audience. It is also able to address some of the tropes that came out of the 90s and noughties teen film boom, which John Hughes preceded and therefore couldn't question, in which films were often told from one character's narrow perspective. In Sex Education, it's not assumed that we're all going to relate to one central character, and because of this, there's the possibility for things like multiple queer narratives, or a better representation of race and class than pretty much all of the old teen movies put together. This diverse representation within the teen fantasy world is absolutely crucial, because it's these years that we spend most of our time fantasizing. There's a lot of time to be spent dreaming about the fulfillment of the new desires that come with adolescence, like sexual desire, or the desire to be more independent, or the desire to be a moody little twat for the best part of a decade. Sorry about that, mum. It's that tension between innocence and experience, where you have newfound adult desires, but you don't quite have the adult freedoms or confidence to act on them yet. So instead, you fantasize, you daydream, you fangirl. In this context, I think movies have even more power to penetrate our subconscious. Teens are more likely to obsess over a show, to engage deeply with it, and to take all of the norms that it sets out as gospel. And that's because as a teenager, either consciously or subconsciously, you're always on the lookout for social cues about what is cool, or how you should act, or even just what's acceptable to desire. Maybe, as well as representing our fantasies, like Freud said, popular culture also plays a part in creating them. TV is controlling my dreams. If the red cups weren't in the teen movies, there'd just be red cups, but since they were in the teen movies, having them at my party made me feel like I was living a teenage dream. The way you turn me on, I can't sleep. Let's run away and don't ever look back. And I mean, sure, the red cups are pretty harmless, but what about the other fantasies that teen movies have informed? Do all teen girls really want one thing? To be a cheerleader who eventually gets kissed by a guy in a Letterman jacket? Or do we just end up wanting that because that's what the films tell us to want? If you're not being represented in the films that you watch, or else you're being misrepresented by a tired teen stereotype, that can really affect your identity, especially at this impressionable age. In the midst of all this arty criticism, it's important not to forget that film is an industry, trying to make those dollar bills. And there are a lot of shows out there that have sold a damaging fantasy of teen life, not just metaphorically, but, moneyphorically. I mean, when I was a teenager, I definitely thought having an eating disorder or a mental breakdown while smoking a cigarette was cool. Oh, skins. Even further down this slippery slope, however, is things like the studies that show a 28.9% rise in teen suicides after 13 Reasons Why was released, which featured a graphic teen suicide scene. Maybe filmmakers or producers have more power than they know, or else they know that they have power over teens to sell them a distorted or romanticised version of teen life, and they do it anyway, no matter how damaging it is, because it's a tried and tested way of making money. The other thing that I think sets sex education apart is because it's actually trying to undo all of the damaging fantasies from the films that we grew up on. There's a lot of really important conversations happening in this show about female pleasure, about queer relationships, about abortion, about consent, about toxic masculinity. You know, conversations that have literally never been on the sex education curriculum in this country. But sex education does more than call out the government. It calls out all the damaging tropes around sex and relationships that have been created by the very films that it aesthetically references. It gives teens what teens want, a good old teen movie, but it also sneaks in what teens need, which is decent, positive, unjudgmental sex advice. By choosing the medium of film and referencing so many teen films that have gone by, sex education is able to do something that the schools could never do. Make sex education cool. And that's the genius of this show. It still lets us indulge in the teenage dream, only this fantasy isn't damaging. But before I toot sex education's horn all the way to climax, I do have a few criticisms. I love how the show subverts old narratives from teen movies, such as the "if I keep making increasingly big romantic gestures at this clearly disinterested woman, she will eventually love me" trope, and the newfound sisterhood that comes out of the updated Breakfast Club style detention that the girls are sent to. But there are moments where sex education kind of rips off contemporary teen movies and then claims it as a subversion of an old one, like the Ferris wheel moment.
You can see a scene like this in Never Been Kissed, but in sex ed, it's about two guys falling for each other, which is pretty typical of how the show's writers flip what we know from teen rom-coms and make it fresh.
Is it, or is it clearly just from Love, Simon?
I don't know her.
Or the weird quiz at the end of series 2, which is just so St. Trinian's that they even got Stephen Fry to play the same role in it. This tends to happen a lot more in series 2, so maybe it's a little bit of second album syndrome. It's at this point where the show, for me, changes from cool teen show with a reflexive dialogue with its influences into just a bit of a rip-off. Also, while I do think Adam's journey in the show is really important in terms of opening up a conversation around toxic masculinity and questioning sexuality, I do just kind of wish Eric ended up with Raheem, you know, instead of a guy who was so horrible to him for so long, because Eric is everything. But those criticisms don't really change the fact that I wish this show was around when I was a teenager. And maybe the teenagers who are teenagers while sex education comes out might be part of the first generation that is allowed to indulge in teenage fantasies without having to deal with the damaging tropes that they come with. Maybe Gen Z's version of an adolescent punk rock rebellion is just demanding more healthy discourse around sex and relationships. And since I really just said that sentence, I think it's time to wrap this up. So overall, I think sex education is good telly, and we have no choice but to stan. And I really hope you stan this video, and if you do, please share it with your friends. No offense, but if you liked it, then you can subscribe to my channel. I'll probably be making more videos soon because I'm unemployed and there's a global pandemic and there's literally nothing else for me to do. Okay, bye! Well, I fix myself into something better than that.